and that was under Reagan. It was the lowest under Carter. It was the highest under Reagan. Since then, it's continued to consistently go down. It did not start with Donald Trump. So, and no one makes me more upset when they tout this out there than the black people who do it, who want to wear MAGA hats and then try to justify it. And then they spout it without actually doing the research that would support their very unsubstantiated claims. So, again, listen, to me, he's showing us who he is. This is who he is. He's either stupid or he's racist, and I vote for all of the above. He's both of those things, because there's, and we'll get into and that's some of what I wanted to get into also, Free, was reading up on some studies that was saying there was a correlation between the two, between lower IQs and racist people. And does that sound plausible to you when you hear that being said out loud?
I can see where a linkage could come, because I think it builds on a level of ignorance. Right. But now let me say, for the record, I make a big distinction between ignorance and racism.
Right.
I think of racism more so in the institutional facet, not in the ignorance of individuals that are not in the or in the seat of making policy or CEOs. Like, for instance, if the man that lives up the street from me comes down the street and calls me the N-word, he's just ignorant, stupid, and dumb. Not a racist, because I'm still gonna go to work, provide for my family. But when you're in a seat of power, where you make decisions that affect people's livelihoods or policies, I think racism in the institutional facet. So, I make the distinction, but there is an ignorance that comes in all levels, because even when you come into the institutional element, you had to learn the ignorance from somewhere.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? To make you exercise policies in that manner. So they go hand in hand. I went several streets just to get back home, but you get what I'm saying.
No. I do get what you're saying. And again, there's an interesting thing, because we went through, and I just wanted to find out, what studies were done to kind of justify whether racism was a form of stupidity, or if it was, what's the best way to put it? If it was, there's a correlation between the two. And I found a study that was done, and there was an article written by the Association for Psychological Science. So this wasn't a left-wing article. This wasn't something I found on MSNBC. This was something that was written August 20th, 2014, and it talked about a few things about how there's a huge correlation between low intelligence and racism, but also authoritarianism, as well as authoritarianism, racism, and sexism. Those three things were huge. But the one thing, and we talked about this in the pre-production meeting, that was glaring was a portion of the article that reads that right-wing ideologies, this is a quote, right-wing ideologies offer well-structured and ordered views of society, views that preserve traditions and norms, so they are especially attractive to those who are threatened by change and want to avoid uncertainty and ambiguity. And you and I had a little bit of back and forth about this earlier, because that is the one thing that stands out. Because when I hear that, what a lot of people I don't think fully understand is how that statement in that entire article doesn't just apply to racist white people. That applies to everyone who is within our society, who, when toppled with other factors such as, and this is what the article also talks about, other factors such as financial and social factors, along with education, when toppled with all of those things, tend to follow more of a conservative view. And that doesn't necessarily mean right-wing conservative view. That just means a more conservative approach, to where when you're changing their environment, they have a hard time wanting to adopt and check on to that change, and as a result, they want to buck. They grasp a hold to what's easier for them to understand, and as a result, then you get this backlash, and that's where you get a lot of your mass shootings come from that. And when I say mass shootings, I'm not talking about when someone walks into when a white gentleman walks into a school and decides to kill a bunch of kids. That's not what I'm talking about. Because if you live in a disenfranchised black neighborhood and there's a drive-by, that's also a mass shooting. A mass shooting is just simply shooting a weapon into a crowd of people. Yeah. Every time you do that, that's a mass shooting. So you can walk in, doesn't matter whether it's a school, a church, a hotel, or the street corner. A mass shooting is a mass shooting. And when you look at that, a lot of people in our community also, Free, and I'm gonna let you go, is they carry a lot of the burden of conservative properties because, again, when I read that, and I want your thoughts after I say this again, it is the right-wing ideologies offer well-structured and ordered views of society. That portion specifically is what grabbed me. What say you to that?
Well, I mean, I agree. You have a side that sees more traditional politics, as you said, the change. But see, here's where the question comes. What is the change that you're afraid of? What is the normalcy that you're accepting of?
Any change. Anything.
But that's what I'm saying. We have to understand, because if you look at the history of its nation and the societal structure, then we have to ask the question, well, what about it, if we're keeping it in the political structure, what change are you so afraid of? Because that lets me know that you've normalized some of the systemic structures that are in place that have not always swayed to those of lower socioeconomic standing, those of black and brown communities. So what is the change that you're afraid of when we make that statement? Then once again, on the flip side, what is that you're accepting of? What have you normalized? So I think that's where we get into the danger situation, because if you look throughout the history of what we've come to normalize and become accustomed to, gerrymandering, voter suppression, refutation of public funding, civil rights. What are you normalized? So that's what I look at, the root of the cause, or what has built to that. Because it's one thing for personal, because we all have things that we don't like to change in our personal concept or structure, context. But when we're talking political, social, I think the problem is what we identify as normal, or what we accept. And then that can get tricky to that and lead to what those studies have shown. It leads a certain thought process toward a group of people, or toward a certain, where you said sexism, everything. It can lead to those ideologies because we're coming from a set that has normalized certain thought processes or ignorances toward individuals, toward classism. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's the dangerous part of that element.
But it's,
and I think when you challenge it, then you see what you see in certain political battles nowadays, because we're fighting that structure.
But when you see that structure, it's not necessarily, it's not always a systematic structure, because again, when I read that portion of it, it spoke to me dearly, because I've seen how people get taken advantage of because of that statement. And what I mean by that is that statement says to me, simplify it the best way you can in people's minds so they could be more accepting of the ideology, even if it's not in their best interest. So if you can find an answer, and again, we don't have a whole lot of time for me to go through this because this is where conspiracy theories lie, is in the mind of people who are trying to simplify a very complex issue, which I think in biases, I think that's called the Duggan effect. I'm not sure, I forgot the name of it, but there's a psychological bias that's attached to it. But my point is ultimately is if you are in an environment, and it doesn't and this isn't particularly on black and white because I see black people that do this too. If you're in an environment where the world is too complex for you and you're trying to simplify it, then you find a way to find yourself an easy answer so you can cope with the more complex world as you see it in your view. And as a result, you end up following a more white-ringed conservative view. And I had a friend of ours, that actually challenged me to say, yeah, there are more black people who are conservative than you think. But what he did was he challenged me, and I'm like, brother, I'm not one of those black people, but I get your point. I know who you're talking about because there are more conservative black people than you would think, and you could see it within the rhetoric for which we spew to ourselves just simply on social media about just judging different areas of our community itself. So yeah, I mean, we have issues with light-skinned people in our community, or just the shade of your skin. All of those things are conservative principles, by the way. Or what color shirt you wearing, what set you're claiming. All of those things are conservative principles. Don't get it twisted. To be able to simplify the world in terms of who should live or die based on the color they're wearing is a conservative principle. And point to me, wave your hand at me free when I'm wrong and what I'm saying. All of those elements are conservative principles. So yeah, we are much more when you are suggesting that your social status is based off of what type of car you drive, or what type of clothes you wear, or what type of job you have. I'm sorry, those are conservative principles, and you seem to find a way to simplify life for yourself while judging others to make it easier for you, and that doesn't take a lot of thought. And I'll end this with a Martin Luther King quote, which and free. I hope I don't mess this up because I just decided to say a Martin Luther King quote without being ready for the quote. So I want you to bear with me just a second while I get myself ready to say this and then take us to break. And as you can see, everybody, I am really dragging this out so I can find the quote.
It's all good though because we have the power of editing, so you don't have to worry that we could edit any gap space and fill it in. But
absolutely,
anyway, no, we like being authentic. We like being authentic. But no, I do agree with you, and I've echoed those sentiments that you spoke to about feeling like I think especially older black voters are more conservative when you look at it, or govern their politics through morals.
Right.
What they've learned coming up. Me having an older father, older parents and aunts and uncles are very conservative if you look at the landscape, which even goes back to the history that their parents were Republicans in a sense, even though the roles in modern times have somewhat kind of flopped between Republican and Democrat, but we're not getting we're not getting into that part. But so I understand that. So then it gets into how we identify those things. But I feel you on that, and I agree. But I know you got your quote ready.
Yeah. So it's and this is basically the point I wanted to make, is because the quote from Martin Luther King is this. And it's my favorite one of his, by the way. Rarely do we find men who are willing to engage in hard, solid thinking. There is an almost universal quest for an easy answer and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think. And that is the reason why